So we gather one last time for this unit to talk about names for the Messiah. And so far we've talked about, and I always think when I woke up this morning, the radio was playing Wonderful Counselor. And I thought, how appropriate. We've talked about Jesus as Wonderful Counselor, the Governor, the Wise Counselor. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. How is Jesus God? Everlasting Father, we discussed last week a little bit. And now finally we come to this term, the Prince of Peace, which is so interesting because I think in our religious tradition and upbringing and everything, we consider peace as that perfect peace with no conflict, right? Where everyone just gets along. And I can remember my first meeting time in chapel at seminary. A woman who I later just really came to love and admire stood up, and she was giving our opening sort of plenary in the chapel. And she said, "So welcome to Princeton Seminary. And don't you think it's interesting that how God just throws us all together and expects us all to just get along?" And she said, "So don't you think we can all just get along?" And she waited for this pause and said, "No, and you won't, and it's okay." So I bring that to you because that's where Walter Brueggermann kind of goes with this idea of Prince, a comfortable chair, not a wooden chair, Prince of Peace, right? The irony that he brings to this text and this notion of Prince of Peace is that this peace, in Hebrew, this shalom, this wholeness, is dependent upon the king being ready for battle, ready to do battle with his enemies, with the enemies of his people, Israel. And in order for him to be ready to do battle, he has to be dependent upon cheap labor to shore up his forces. And cheap labor was always conscripted labor. So you didn't come into work for the king and for upholding that earthly kingdom by choice necessarily. So all of a sudden we have these kinds of ideas that are in conflict with what our notion of bringing peace on earth means. When we look at the book of 1 Kings and we talk about the reign of Solomon, Solomon's shalom, his idea of peace, was all built on this version of conscripted labor. John, do you have your Bible here?
Yeah.
Can you read for us 1 Kings 5, 13 to 18? It tells us a little bit about this notion of who helps ensure a peaceable kingdom.
Okay, 1 Kings 5.
13 to 18.
King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shift of 10,000 a month. So they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 forcemen who supervised the project and directed the workers. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Babylon cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple.
So that's the description of building Solomon's temple, but it's all about conscripted labor. And that's also who feeds Solomon's armies, right? So you have this notion of peace being unattainable without a mighty conscripted army of people to maintain the city, to build the temple, to feed the armies. And that notion of peace and shalom is in contrast to what we find in Psalm 72. And if I can depend on John one more time, there are two verses in particular that give us a different idea of what peace is all about. And I think that's more in keeping with our notion, our understanding. In Psalm 72, if you can read 1 through 3 and then 7.
Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. May the mountains bring prosperity to the people, the hills, the fruit of righteousness. Verse 7, in his days, may the righteous flourish and prosperity abound till the moon is no more.
So in Psalm 72, we have this other notion of what makes for peace, God's peace, through a king of God's choosing. And it's this notion that the poor and the needy will have justice, that there'll be prosperity for all people, not just the elite or the upper class. That there will be no coercion to get people to work. There'll be no exploitation as far as work policies are concerned. And this interesting notion of disarmament. Disarmament can be freely undertaken or it can be coerced. And we have examples of both in the biblical literature. Freely undertaken disarmament, putting down our weapons, comes to us in the book of Isaiah at the very beginning, the 2nd chapter. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And we find that repeated again in Micah. In the 4th chapter, 1 through 5, the same words. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains. And again, they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. That is in contrast to this coercive notion of disarmament, which is enforced by the victor who takes away the arms of the loser. You'll hear more about winners and losers in a little bit in the 2nd service. And he burns them. He burns them, he destroys, because that is what the Bible commands. When you go into a foreign land and you conquer it, you take everything and you destroy it, and then you start over. That's where this notion of holy war or just war comes from. That includes the people. So that's a coercive idea of disarming a nation. In Isaiah 9, we have that notion also. For all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. That's what that means. So this anticipated Prince of Peace will be a victor who can impose disarmament on his adversaries. That's this notion that people had of who this Messiah would be based on their understanding of what a Messiah would be, what a king, a just king would be. In Psalm 46, we have also their understanding of what God will do and how God will act. God will end war. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. So an imposition of peace by the victor, the winner, is also a story that comes to us in the book of Joshua. I don't know how many of us have read Joshua lately, but Joshua comes in to the land of the Gibeonites, and eventually it says he makes peace with them through a treaty. He guarantees their lives. And the leaders of the congregation, this is where the religious element comes into the picture, swore an oath to them. So we have this odd combination of the religious aspect of peace and peacekeeping and peacemaking, and the what I would call, from the people's point of view, the practical perspective. Well, who's going to maintain and ensure that peace, and how are we going to do it? Well, we do it through armies. And if we can't get enough people, we're going to make sure we get enough people by coercion, bringing them along. So this is not the peace, the shalom of our imaginations, but what makes for political reality. This notion of what it takes to keep and maintain peace. And Walter Brueggermann says something so interesting to me, which I don't know why I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe I've thought about it, but not been able to articulate it the way he does. He says, the rhetoric of peace serves an important function in keeping a vision of an alternative society alive. I'm going to read that again, because I think it applies to us too. The rhetoric of peace serves an important function in keeping a vision of an alternative society alive. How many of us were around in the 60s? We're going to date ourselves. So I was just a little babe back in the 60s. I was young in the 60s. But didn't we have the peace movement, right? And how did that rhetoric serve a function for our society in keeping that vision of peace alive? Because it was juxtaposed against Vietnam, right? And that notion of peace, shalom, wholeness, integrity, that was carried by many people, ran smack up against this other vision of what is needed to maintain peace in the world, which was an armed movement, right? So that's nothing new, folks. And what we're going through right now is not new. I mean, this is going back to this oracle in Isaiah, these notions of what it takes to make for peace. This human notion of peace and God's understanding of what makes for peace. Walter says, in ancient Israel, political realities, the situation on the ground, rarely coincided with religious visions of what made for peace. Rarely. I think we're in that position also. So there's a vision of peace that comes to us out of Ezekiel, and I talked a little bit about Ezekiel last week. In the 34th chapter, he says, I will make with them a covenant of peace and banish wild animals from the land so that they may live in the wild and sleep in the woods securely. I will make a covenant of peace with them, and I will bless them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary among them forevermore. It's God's notion of peace. That beautiful picture we have of the peaceable kingdom, right? The child will put his hand on the asps, the hole of the asp, and will not be bitten. The wolf will lay down. The wolf lay down with the lion. The sheep lay down with the lion. And in Isaiah, how beautiful are the feet of them who bring glad tidings of peace. So there's this hope we have in our religious understanding of what makes for peace. It's that hope of faith that we can respond to what Brueggermann calls our better angels, to choose the path of peace. What is it? If only we knew what made for peace. Brueggermann brings to us this understanding of the peace of Jesus as restorative and transformative. And he says that Jesus overcame that contradiction between reality and vision, between what was happening on the ground for people and that looking ahead, that hope, that faith for what could be. So he's not a prince of peace in the sense of a victor who comes in and imposes it and burns all the weapons of the defeated people. But he contradicts the old expectations of Isaiah's oracle, of Rome, of empire. That's why it was such a stretch for people to try and understand Jesus as this Messiah that Isaiah talked about. Such a huge stretch. It still is today. The peace that passes all human understanding, peace by way of vulnerability. Look at this little baby we have here. That's the Prince of Peace. That's the King who's going to defeat all the armies. That's the mighty warrior, right? People could not understand that. Born of a peasant girl, right? They weren't even married, for crying out loud, okay? People bring all these notions of who this Messiah should be, and this tiny little babe is the least and the furthest away from that notion, that expectation. So this idea of Prince of Peace is a juxtaposition of terms. It's an oxymoron. The peace he brings cannot be understood using any of our categories, our normal categories, right? So because Brueggermann thinks it's such a stretch for us to understand Jesus the way Isaiah describes him, he looks at Luke. I know that's one of our favorite passages, the infancy narrative from Luke. We read it almost every year. This year we're leaning a little toward Matthew, I noticed, and the stories are different. But in Luke, he says we can begin to understand how Jesus could be that Prince of Peace. So Rome sees Jesus as a threat to the status quo. That Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was very much a conscripted peace, right? How could there be peace in Rome? Well, because you have huge armies and lots of people, laborers, working for the government under threat of death. Jesus' ministry involves the restoration of the healthy order of creation. And it's enacted through individuals, which is inherently subversive to Rome, right? Instead of coming from a top-down position and telling people what they're going to do, Jesus is going one-on-one, one person to another in a relationship and healing them. Very subversive work he does. Jesus says this word over and over to the people that he heals. He says, Shalom, peace be with you. Go, for you have been made well. And when he says that, he's recognizing that this perfect order of creation has been restored within that person. So it's a very personal ministry he has, a personal working of peace. And he anticipates that his disciples will do that very same thing. One person to another. And that's why at the end of his life, before he's killed, he weeps over Jerusalem. If only you would recognize the things that make for peace. It's not about conscripted labor and slaves and armies and building up mighty cities, right? It's about one-on-one going to each person and building up that relationship. So what are these things that make for peace? The capacity to forgive, a readiness to share and share abundantly, generously, doing away with classism. That's an interesting thing Brueggermann brings to this. So he's trying to level the field a little bit, and Sandy will talk about that in the sermon today. Being attentive to the vulnerable and the unproductive. Think about that for a minute. What does that mean? Giving them attention. Having humility. Being willing to be last, not first. Denying yourself in the interest of your neighbor. All of those practices contradict the conventional assumptions of everyday business, the way things are done around here. And refusing the things that make for peace, the everyday world, Brueggermann says, generates a society of hostility, aggression, greed, conflict, and violence. Jesus wept. He said also to Pilate, my kingdom is not from this world. Pilate didn't know what to do with Jesus, right? He didn't have any categories either to define who Jesus was, because Pilate himself could not understand this way Jesus had, this way of truth that contradicted worldly power. That's where Pilate lived. So Jesus' peace is a peace that defies the way the world is organized. His disciples are sent out to defy the way the world is organized for the sake of real peace. We confess Jesus as Prince of Peace, but it's not our normal understanding of peace. His peace, Brueggermann says, is dangerous. It's subversive and it's a contradiction of business as usual. Advent is a time to acknowledge that what we anticipate in Isaiah's oracle deeply contradicts the expectations of ancient Israel. Deeply. Of those who trusted the Roman Empire. Of the Jews. This was not what they were anticipating. And of other people. It overrides our own expectations. And I think that's a really important point. I think in this great ongoing inability to reconcile the differences between Judaism and Christianity, we want to somehow say, well, the Jews don't believe that Jesus could have been the Messiah, right? Are the Jews the only ones that don't believe that? Not if you go back to this oracle and look at it and see what a stretch it is to frame Jesus as this Messiah who was going to fulfill all of these titles, right? Do we really believe Jesus fit those notions of what the people understood the Messiah to be? Probably not. We wouldn't frame him that way either. So I think that's such an important point. It overrides our own expectations. As we await a peacemaker who will, I need my glasses, who will ensure our advantage in the world. Oh, we await a peacemaker who will ensure our advantage in the world. That's the bottom line right there. We want peace, perfect peace, but we want it the way we want it. Yeah. And we forget that we're going to have to give up something in order for that peace, that wholeness, that integrity to come to creation. And Brueggemann's final point before we go to discussion is that the Christ child is innocent, but is not innocuous. The Christ child is innocent, but not innocuous. Bearing Jesus into the world was dangerous. It threatened everything that had come before. And it was bringing life and salvation into a world that would reject him because he did not fit the requirements. And I guess my question for all of us is, how do we reject this Jesus child who comes to us and doesn't fit our requirements for what we think this Messiah should be, this Prince of Peace? So I leave you with that before our discussion. I wonder if you have any questions or things you want to bring up about our 4 weeks together. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Not the Jesus we might know.
Right? Jesus know.
That question has been debated for...
Those titles were going to be assigned to him.
I'm sure as he was living his life, he heard them, right? Because he was a good Jew. Jesus was a Jew. He studied his Torah. He would have known all of those things. He studied Isaiah.
Did he identify with?
That's a great question. Not in the terms that were applied to him through the text, I would say. He would say, when he says, my kingdom is not of this world, he's saying, I'm not going to fit. I'm not going to fit into your book. I'm not going to fit into all of your words that you have for me. You're going to have to find some new words because I'm not going to fit.
So did the writers of the gospel put those labels on?
Brueggermann says that that's where we have to go in order for us to understand how we interpret Jesus. The question that you're asking has been debated for centuries. Did Jesus know who he was?
Or who the gospels say?
Mm-hmm. Well, see, the Gospels were written way after Jesus' death.
So
that's our interpretation on the other side of who Jesus was, right? So we have this Old Testament understanding of who Jesus would be, or who the Messiah would be, not necessarily Jesus of Nazareth, because nothing good comes out of Nazareth, right? And then you get to the other side, after his death and resurrection. Oh, who is this Jesus? This man that went around healing and teaching and bringing his peace. Well, he's that guy that they hung on the cross. So what can it mean that he was the Messiah? Right? And that's why men have tried to interpret who he was for centuries. Right? Matthew, Mark, Luke. Probably Mark first, at least in our understanding. But that question, did Jesus know who he was? Did Jesus understand himself in those terms? Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Divine, Prince of Peace. It's such a good question. We don't know. We just don't know. We know that he certainly had this relationship with God, called him Abba, Father. And the gospel writers write about that and frame that for us. But did he understand his identity to that extent? We don't really know. We know he believed in his mission and that he came from God. So it's just fascinating. Councils met for centuries to debate that question. The book of John, if we read the book of John, deals with that question of Jesus' divinity and what he knew or didn't know. The hymn, Did Mary Know, is that same question. I don't have good answers for you.
then why are we here?
We're here to ask the questions, right?
Okay.
John.
Can we say that truly Isaiah's prophecy was truly referring to Christ, or I remember, like you said, it's our own Christian coloration and understanding that walk towards that interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
But can we say these prophecies? Okay, some of us believe that these prophecies were actually having Christ in mind.
Right.
Yeah. So in this case, how do we interpret that?
And so Sandy and I had this great discussion.
Okay.
It's a theological discussion, right? Can we really say, so many centuries before he was born, that Isaiah was writing about Jesus? And what we came away with was, well, Isaiah was certainly writing about the anticipated Messiah. He absolutely was defining who that person would be. Was Isaiah writing about this particular Jesus of Nazareth? My opinion would be probably not. It's like us trying to predict when will Jesus return? What will that look like? Well, we know the exact date and time, and he's going to show up in the Acme down the street, right? And we get the media there because they better be there to tell everybody. And it's going to be on Facebook, so make sure you watch, right? I mean, we contextualize everything is what we like to do, so we can give ourselves some certainty about it. Because we need to know. My guess is Isaiah did not know it would be this Jesus of Nazareth, but he believed that, yes, there will be a Messiah, and he would fit this description. That's the best we can probably do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is not an oracle that's going to give us a lot of comfort if you look at it from this point of view.
Because actually, if that is the picture of the Messiah, given to us by Isaiah, and then now we are struggling to, we are not even very sure if Jesus knows if he fits in that, then I'll just try to organize my thoughts and see, okay, well, it's just a matter of faith. I say, well, I believe that by faith, because since using my own reasoning and understanding cannot really give me the answer to this, then I would just apply faith to it and accept it that he was referring to Jesus, and Jesus fit into this prophecy, and he's the Savior. So that's I don't know if that's what I'm trying to reach now in my conclusion now. Yeah.
And so one of the things that I would bring to us as we sort of ponder these things in our hearts is there's a reason that the Gnostic Gospels are not in our Bible. So the Gnostics were this group of people who were pretty sure they could think their way through everything, right? If they just thought about it enough and studied it enough and gained enough knowledge and increased in their levels of knowledge, they could figure it out. And the problem with that approach is it doesn't leave any room for faith. There's a whole body of discovered works passed down to us from the Gnostic, Gnostic writers that were not purposely included in our Bible for that reason. You cannot, in the end, think your way to faith. It comes to us out of our lived experience. We can read, certainly, and study and look at these texts and consider who was writing them and what was going on in their world at the time. For me, when I do that and I engage in that process, I always come away with my faith enriched. To think about what they were going through, and yet they wrote, especially in the Old Testament, of what would come. So for me, this is a beautiful oracle of Isaiah that demonstrates tremendous faith in what would happen in the future. It's when we get into the particulars of how that plays out and how Jesus fulfilled or did not fulfill all those titles that our faith kind of goes in different directions. Yeah.
It was written while they were in Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they were
they're in exile.
At the bottom of their experience.
Mm-hmm. And it helps us to know that too. And yet he's writing about a future that will be much, much better.
So are there any books that Cubans have written about the end of their exile?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Lots of the world is in exile right now. And sometimes we are too. It's not just the folks in Syria. They are physically being exiled as we speak, right? But we live in exile sometimes in our hearts and souls too. So that's why we can relate.
Our own choosing?
Sometimes. Okay. Well, if you want to, you can sit around and discuss, but I think there's worship at 10:30.